أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. So this lecture is intended to be, like he said, a sequel to last year's lecture. I wanted to share with you a couple of practices that I've discovered myself and I found to be very beneficial for reading the Quran. I thought about speaking about, for instance, the adab of how to read the Quran and different kinds of techniques that are mentioned in ahadith. But I think more useful than that might be to share these experiences that I've had myself. We all are challenged by reading the Quran. We find it very difficult oftentimes. Of course, there's a recitation aspect, correct pronunciation and tajweed. That's one aspect of it, the aesthetics of the Quran. Now, we spoke about that some last year as well. But even in terms of the meaning of it, and it's not only a problem of translation, which we talked about last year. Translation does pose a barrier, but even the Quran itself, for those who know Arabic, even those who know Arabic well, it still poses challenges. It's not a simple book that you read through and you can just kind of summarize and say, well, this surah is about this, and here from beginning to end, it's a continuous kind of series of thoughts that are all connected clearly in introduction and body and conclusion. It's not laid out like that. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get a grasp of what exactly the surah is talking about until you look at it in a particular way. So there are a few experiences that I had that have been very helpful to me. One is that we know that the Quran, the way it's arranged now, is not the way it was historically revealed. In terms of the order of the surahs, the order that it's now in is basically in terms of the length of the surahs, from longest to shortest for the most part. We have some ahadith that mention the order of revelation, and so what has proved very beneficial to me was to go through and read the Quran in the order of revelation, at least according to these ahadith. There's some that are usually relied upon, narrated from Abdullah ibn Abbas, and so we have the order. Our scholars as well, Allama Tabatabai, he mentions this order in his Quran in Islam, which is translated in English here, it's available to you. So take that as one hypothesis, one possibility for the order of surahs, and read in that order. And especially if you can do that in parallel with a study of history. So one thing that I discovered that was new to me, that I hadn't paid attention to before, is, for instance, the fact that there are a vast number, the vast majority of surahs are Meccan surahs. Right? So out of the 114 surahs, something on the order of 85 to 90, if I'm not mistaken, are Meccan surahs, which leaves only a very small proportion that are Medinan. Right? Even though the Prophet spent almost half of his time of the revelation of the Quran in Medina, but the number of surahs is much less. They're longer surahs, they have a different nature. So I think I never appreciated the difference between Meccan and Medinan surahs until I looked at it from this perspective, and I realized that, there actually is something very different about the Meccan surahs than there is about the Medinan surahs. Medina surahs tend to speak about fiqh, tend to speak about war, about zakah, and it's institution building, not just getting your foot in the door by correcting your beliefs on life and death and judgment and basic tenets of faith. Now it's more practical. We're implementing on a societal level as government and these kinds of things. You also see certain personalities come out. There's a personality that I would guess maybe you haven't heard of it, because I hadn't heard of him very spoken about very much. So Walid ibn Mughira, is that a name that's familiar to you? So, it doesn't appear like it from your reaction. So Walid ibn Mughira, we don't speak about him very much. When we speak about the enemies of the Prophet, we speak of Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab and Abu Sufyan and these people. But actually early on, this Walid ibn Mughira is extremely important. And so a lot of the early surahs, even in Surah Al-Alaq, the very first surah that's revealed, right? After the first 5 verses, which are the very first, this أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يَنْهَى عَبْدًا إِذَا صَلَّى, these references to this person who is telling the Prophet not to worship and not to pray, this is supposed to be a reference to this Walid ibn Mughira. And so many other surahs, these early surahs about the mustahzi'een, those who are mocking the Prophet and ridiculing, calling him a magician, calling him these kinds of names, a lot of them say that it's a reference to this individual. Right? So it gives you some insight into the way that the revelation started, the problems that the Prophet faced in the early days. And in many ways, we're in that position now. Right? We're kind of just exiting a jahiliyyah now. Maybe we're still halfway in the jahiliyyah of our own. And so we're also in a very similar position to the Prophet in terms of facing ridicule, in terms of facing certain kinds of hardship. And so looking at the Quran in that way and seeing how the Quran was revealed to him, which indicates what kinds of things he was facing in those early days, is very insightful for us in our position. That's one approach that leads to new insights that's different from simply reading it from Fatiha to Nas. Another approach that I found very useful has been to look at the surahs, and this is, I should give credit to Sayyid Sulaiman that he gave inspiration to this, and then I took it and ran with it. To look at the surahs as a whole, to try to see if you can understand. I mentioned in the beginning, the surahs are not laid out the way we liked things to be laid out, where it's all very cohesive and very kind of connected in an obvious way. But the surahs are entities. The surahs themselves are revealed, not necessarily revealed together, but intended to be together by the Prophet himself. So even if they're not completely connected in an obvious way, the Prophet intended Surah Al-Baqarah to be one entire surah by itself. Not that he randomly took verses and put them together, but they were intended to be part of a whole. And so there should be some unifying theme, some unifying idea that binds the verses of Surah Al-Baqarah together, for instance. And so what I've done is to kind of go through and read each surah and kind of zoom out a little bit. Right? Instead of looking at each individual verse and not necessarily being able to connect it to the one before it and after it, to now read it and kind of look at it with a broad scope, and to see what is the general idea of the surah. What is the basic idea? Usually the surahs introduce themselves and say, this is guidance for those who are muttaqeen, for instance. Or this is, there are people who call you a magician, no, they're wrong. And so that kind of sets the tone that this is the message of the surah. That people are ridiculing the Prophet, and now the whole surah is about denying what they're claiming, defending the Prophet, consoling the Prophet, empowering the Muslims and how to deal with this kind of ridicule. So you kind of see that unifying element in the entire surah, and that's also very, very insightful. There's some surahs that are focused on, for instance, like Surah Al-An'am, for instance. So Surah Al-An'am, if you notice, it's all about ihtijaj, all about debating and refuting different claims and different arguments that are being leveled against the Prophet. And so that surah, if you notice, it has many, many verses that start with qul, where it's telling the Prophet, tell them this, tell them this, tell them this, it's giving him responses for how to deal with all of the arguments that are being leveled at him. Right? So it gives you kind of a theme, a general theme in the surah that then unifies the entire thing. One third approach that I think is also beneficial is to focus on the stories that are told in the Quran. Right? So a lot of the Quran is dealing with the stories of the prophets in particular, and then we have some other stories like Ashab al-Kahf, for instance, or Dhul Qarnayn, some stories like that. So it's useful then to spend some time looking at those stories as a whole. Right? Look at all the verses together and figure out the story itself. So now you have the story in your mind, you know beginning to end what the story is. So now every time you see a snippet of that story mentioned in some surah somewhere, you know how that particular snippet of the story fits into the whole. Because you've solved the story, you've understood the story as a whole. And that's really, I talked about this last year, how the Quran is meant to be read in a way where it's constantly reminding us of those things that are most important. So you don't find the entire story of Musa in one place. Right? With the exception of Prophet Yusuf, you don't find any other story kind of mentioned all in one place. But the benefit of that is in my daily reading, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to come across just a mention of 3 or 4 of the prophets at least. And if I already have in my mind what the whole story is, then that one reminder of Prophet Musa on a daily basis is very helpful. It helps to hearken kind of all those ideas that I have about Musa, and I'm able to draw from that reservoir of knowledge that I have to understand this one particular remembrance. All right, so those are 3 different approaches that I think are very helpful to look at the Quran from a little different perspective without just reading it from beginning to end, but now actually making a study of it, but in a way that is very insightful. Another practice that I like to encourage you to do is to memorize the Quran. And when I say that, not necessarily to memorize beginning to end. That's one goal that definitely people should try to endeavor to do. but more practically, probably for most people, is to memorize particularly those verses that you hear most often. Right? You'll notice if you're active in listening to speeches of scholars that there are certain verses that are constantly repeated. And you shouldn't, if you listen to it a couple of times, you see that this verse is constantly being repeated, it must be an important verse, then that should make you curious enough to go and find that verse. Go search for it, find out where it is. Ask the speaker, do your own search. Or find that verse and memorize that verse. Look at the translation, see if you can find out some more about it. See how it relates to that particular speech you just heard. And now you have one little piece that's additional, that you now have an additional tool. Next time you hear that same verse, which is going to probably be repeated another dozen times in your lifetime, you're now empowered to understand that particular part. So what this does is, I'm sorry, I'm combating this cough. So what this does is we can empower ourselves in pieces because the Quran is laid out in a way that is not so well, it's not so cohesive in the obvious way. We don't need to approach it in that way either. We don't need to necessarily have an understanding of the entire Quran and say, well, I read it once, I didn't get it. Right? But rather I can take one verse that I've now seen how it's being used. I've seen how a scholar has used that verse and explained it and applied it in a certain way. Now let me at least study that one little verse. That one little verse is now in my pocket as a tool that I can use. Now next time it's mentioned, then I'm empowered. Next time similar verses are mentioned, because there's a lot of parallel structure in the Quran where one verse is going to be repeated dozens of times probably in the Quran. So all of a sudden you're empowered in a way that's very special. And now when you read the Quran, now at least that verse stands out for you. When you come across that verse in your daily reading, you'll have an understanding of that one verse. Right? And the same thing for another and another, and slowly you're building your kind of repertoire of things that you're familiar with in the Quran. Another piece of advice I want to offer is to do your best to learn Arabic. Become familiar with Arabic. Learning it in a way that you can independently understand the Quran and Ahadith, that's probably out of the range of possibility for many of you, because it takes a lot more study than you'll necessarily be able to give considering your other obligations in life. But that doesn't mean that it's not an all or nothing thing. Become familiar with Arabic to the extent that you can. Those of you who are in college, find a university, go to a university, not only that's strong in the discipline you want to study, but make sure it also has a good Arabic program. That's a great way to study a language. You have to study a language anyway in your first couple of years as part of your core curriculum usually. So why not choose Arabic? Right? At least that familiarity with conversational modern standard Arabic is a really good first step into being at least familiar with ideas in how Arabic works. You get an intuition for how the language works. Now when you read a verse, you may not understand it because you don't have the vocabulary, you don't understand all the details of what's happening. But now you look at a translation of that verse and you can kind of see, I see how it makes sense. I see how this Arabic is communicating that English. And that itself is amazing. I remember when I first started learning Arabic, when I listened to my first speech in Arabic and I understood something, and I was on cloud nine. I was so elated that the language actually made some sense to me. Right? And so it builds a connection in a way that's very actually meaningful. Again, not to give you a sense that now I know Arabic, I've studied 2 years of Arabic, so now I'm an expert and I can read the Quran independently. Of course, that's not going to happen. Right? But you have a familiarity which now brings you closer, and it's not, you don't have to just take people's word for it anymore. Now you can actually see that, wait, this verse is not apparently saying what you're saying it's saying. Can you explain it to me? Show me how this verse is saying what you're claiming it's saying. And now that there's some meaning in there as well. Lastly, our attitude towards the Quran needs to be one of humility. I spoke about this last year. I want to just reiterate the same idea. Sometimes we are scared to approach the Quran. We're so used, especially in the Shia community, because of our strong scholarship, we're so used to being spoon-fed a lot of ideas that we're not often used to engaging with things independently. So we feel like, I read this verse, I have no clue what it means, let me go ask someone. Right? Rather than looking at it and thinking yourself and saying, it seems to be saying such and such. This is my hypothesis. It looks like the verse is saying such and such. Let me keep that as a provisional idea of what the verse is saying according to my understanding. And this is not tafsir bil ra'i, because I'm not saying that the Quran is definitely saying what I think it's saying with my own ignorance. I'm simply saying that from what I understand so far, this is what it seems to be saying. That's a very humble statement. And that's provisional. Now I use that as my hypothesis and I engage. If I have someone who's a little bit more well-versed than I am, I present that to them and say, this verse seems to be saying this. Is this correct or not? What do you think about this idea? And they correct you and say, no, you're absolutely wrong, and here's what it's actually saying. And you say, oh, now I understand why that was wrong, and now this is my new provisional understanding. Right? So you're engaging with it actively, which is good. You're also humble, which is extremely important. And that's becoming a springboard for you now to engage with it further in a more meaningful way. And it's definitely going to be a lifelong journey. I have tried to engage with the Quran quite a bit in my years of study. But I still, on a regular basis, I still come up with very new understandings of verses that I've been looking at for a long time from before. Especially if I hear someone else talk about it. Right, Shaykh Hamza mentioned one verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, Laysa al-Bir. He mentioned it in a way that I hadn't thought of it before. Right, he expanded it in such a way, so it gave me a new way of thinking of that same verse that I've probably read 1,000 times. Right, but now I understood a little bit something different. Right, and that's the way we need to constantly engage with it. So don't be scared, engage, but engage in a humble way, and the fruits will come, inshallah. Recite one salawat, please. I'm going to take the last 5 minutes of my time and address something related to the talk I gave 2 days ago. Some of you are still present who were in that talk as well. Inshallah, Sayyid Sulaiman and I are going to both speak about certain aspects of it. We don't want to talk about the actual topic itself, which was about the severity of the Prophet of Mercy, but more about the approach that we should take. I want to speak about the approach that a scholar takes towards difficult material, and I think inshallah he's going to talk about the approach that non-specialists should take when they are also faced with difficult to understand material. Oftentimes as scholars we are faced with information that is challenging, that seems to be outside of the scope of what we've known so far. For instance, we have reports that the Prophet, you've heard the story when the first revelation came, how he was in the cave of Hira, and he was confused when Gabriel spoke to him, and he had no clue what was happening. He thought maybe he's possessed by a jinn. He wanted to commit suicide. And all of this is narrated in the Sirah Nabawiyah of Ibn Hisham. Right, in other places as well, but this is one of the primary sources of it, Ibn Ishaq's narration of it. And so we're presented with this idea that the Prophet, this was his first engagement with revelation and with Gabriel. And he was confused, and it wasn't until Waraqa reassured him and said, oh, actually, the one who talked to you was Al-Namus al-Akbar. Saint Gabriel that talked to Moses and Jesus, that's the one who talked to you. And then the Prophet said, oh, okay, great. I'm not possessed by shaitan, it's just Gabriel talking to me. And so then he was all of a sudden clear that he was a prophet. Right? Which is an absurd story on so many fronts. So we're faced with this story, then how do we engage with it? So if we can, one way to approach it would be to look at the sources themselves and see, is the source itself something that has some reliability? That sometimes helps us out. Sometimes the source might be reliable, though, or we can't really determine based on sources. We can also look at the content itself and see if the content itself has problems with it, where it goes against something that we rationally know to be true, whether it goes against another body of text that we know that are so widely reported that we're sure that's true, and since this is in conflict with that, there's much more evidence to the contrary, one piece of evidence saying this one problematic thing, so we'll favor the vast majority of evidence over the limited evidence. So we have certain techniques like that we'll use. So in this instance, obviously, for a prophet to be uncertain and not to know whether he's being revealed to and being spoken to by God or by shaitan, that's obviously problematic. It goes against everything we know about who the prophet is, what kind of character he has, and his efficacy, his whole personality as a prophet becomes problematic. How can I then trust him if he can't even trust himself? If he doesn't even know himself whether God's speaking to him, then how can I know that God's speaking to him? So the whole system falls apart if that story is true. And so we can reject it on that basis and consign it to some sort of a mythology. Sometimes we find that the source itself is problematic, like the stories about the origin of Shi'i Islam, that it originated with Abdullah bin Saba, this Jewish man in the time of Uthman, and he's the one who basically founded the whole sect and had this whole movement. So when we look at this whole story, we find that the source of it all goes back to Tabari, the history of Tabari. And Tabari also quotes it from this one individual named Shaykh ibn Umar. And the Shaykh ibn Umar, among Sunni historiographers, is an extremely problematic person. He was known for being a liar, a storyteller, a fabricator, an embellisher of stories and these kinds of things. And so he's completely dishonored and disqualified, even in Sunni realms. And he's the only source of this one story about Abdullah bin Saba. And so based on that kind of reasoning as well, besides the fact that even reasonably it doesn't make sense for that to be the origin of it, but even based on the sources we can say that this story is disqualified. So I know sometimes it's tempting when you're faced with something to quickly say, what's the sanad, as though that's meaningful to you, and to reject it if it doesn't have a solid chain of transmission all the way back. Honestly speaking, most of history will have to be thrown out if that's the standard. Most of our ahadith of al-kafi would be thrown out as well. If you want to say, what's the sanad, and if it's not strong, I'm going to throw it out. We have so many ahadith that are weak, and being weak does not necessarily mean that it's untrue. So don't use that as a trump card to say that, what's the sanad? If the sanad's good, then I'll accept it. If it's not, then I'm going to reject it. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. That's not the way scholars look at things. In terms of the content itself, we can evaluate it, and even there we need to be cautious. If there's a hadith, a report that's attributed to the Prophet, to the Imams, because of who they are and the understanding we have of them, we should be extremely humble in trying to determine whether or not this is a false tradition. To jump to the conclusion that it's false just because it doesn't make sense to me is not a very good approach. Because there I'm giving priority to my own sensibilities that are very, have a lot of shortcomings. And I'm using that limited understanding to evaluate and say, since this doesn't make immediate sense to me, therefore I reject it. Right? The other approach would be to push it a little bit further and see, is there any possible justification? Is there any way that I could understand that this hadith be true, and that there be a good explanation for why the Prophet would say something or do something, or the Imam would say something or do something, within the realm of possibility? If there's a possible way to make sense of that hadith within and not have to reject it, right, we favor that. We'd rather do that than go to the extreme or go to the extent of saying, because this hadith doesn't immediately make sense, I'm going to throw it against the wall, as the Prophet says, with a hadith that we know to be false and falsely attributable to them, then we throw it against the wall, meaning we discard it completely. But to do that, you have to be confident that it's truly a lie. It's truly a fabrication. So if there's a way that we can understand it that does make sense, there can be a justification, there are unknowns that could possibly come in and help us to have a better understanding of that issue, then we should do that. It's kind of like how we deal with each other. We have those recommendations that, for instance, if you say something to me that's potentially offensive, right, I shouldn't jump to the conclusion that you're definitely offending me. Right? I should try to think what possible explanations could there be for what you've just said to me. Maybe you're in a bad mood, maybe someone else hurt you and now you're taking it out on me. Maybe you actually had good intentions and I just misunderstood. Like, there's so many different possibilities for me to interpret what you've just said to me that are not offensive. So is it reasonable for me to jump to the conclusion that you must have been trying to offend me, that's why you said it, when there are other possibilities that are unoffensive? No, it's not reasonable. It's not good ethics to do that. Right? So the same way, when you have a hadith that's attributed to the Imams of the Prophet, that's possibly justifiable, then we should look for those justifications and see what all justifications there could possibly be, and entertain those first before we jump to the conclusion that this is definitely a false hadith and then we throw it away. And so for that reason, you'll find that scholars are extremely careful. They don't easily reject hadith. They don't easily discard them, because the consequence of doing that is you're saying that you're basically saying the Imam couldn't have said this or never said this. What if he actually did? And now you haven't understood it correctly. Right? So until you're completely positive and sure that there's no way that this could fit with the Prophet, the Imams, their character, the rest of their seerah, until you're absolutely sure that it's a lie, we usually don't put our foot on that side of the kind of like overstep that bounds and take that kind of a step to discard the hadith altogether. So hopefully that's a little bit of understanding from the scholar's perspective on how to deal with problematic traditions. And inshallah, Sayyid will enlighten us on kind of the other side of it, how we should react when we hear certain things like this, and what kinds of mental processes we should go through in that regard. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.